Okay, well, it's 9:15, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christopher Miller, and this is for IPv6, good, bad, and needs to be included into your network. So welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for showing up. So what's to be covered? In order to stand there, I can flip over to my laptop just yet.
It does so automatically, you set the wait.
Okay. They had it working earlier.
There it is. There we go.
Okay, there we go. So we've already seen this. Okay, what's to be covered? A little bit of history on IPv4 and IPv6, how the protocols are both alike and how they are different, where you can and cannot use IPv6 in today's day and age, or rather, so this current timeline, how the transition from IPv4 to IPv6 will progress, or is likely to progress, who's making the shift and who's falling behind, specifically your ISP that you may be using somewhere in the Mid-Atlantic area. And also, the last thing I'm going to be going through over a quick and easy method of how you can get IPv6 working in your home network or your small business using probably the hardware you already have in your possession right now. And it won't cost you anything. So, introductions again. My name is Christopher Miller. I've been on the Macintosh platform since the early days of the Macintosh Plus and Classic, where I managed monochrome screens and local talk networks and that sort of thing. Also with System 6, a long time ago. I'm definitely showing my age. I'm originally from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, right at the tip of Lancaster County, in between Berks and Lebanon counties. I'm now living in Baltimore, Maryland, with my lovely wife and two children. I work for the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. We don't have any professors, we don't have any doctors, beds, or classrooms. The Applied Physics Lab is a Department of Defense research site. We are most commonly known, or historically known, as the inventors of the VT fuse. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. A little fill-in, the VT stands for variable timing. And the name was sort of a mix-up or a piece of disinformation against the Nazis and the Japanese, because variable timing could mean just about anything. The head of an artillery round is a very imprecise thing, and the laboratory was called upon. They got a bunch of eggheads together through the military, and they decided they needed a head on an artillery round that would go near a metallic object. Think about it, if you're on a battleship or a cruiser out in the Pacific, how hard it is to hit a Japanese zero from about 3 or 4 miles away when the ship's also bobbing up and down the water. It's extraordinarily difficult. So they have a little saying around the lab that, the old saying is, close only counts in hand grenades and horseshoes. Well, the third thing was the VT fuse. When they would essentially launch a round off the ships or off the guns of the ships, if they got anywhere near a Japanese zero, it would explode and essentially throw thousands of metal fragments and bring down the plane. So it didn't have to be terribly precise. And it helped us win the war in the Pacific during World War II. So that's a little history of the laboratory. This gentleman's picture off on the right-hand side is named Vince Cerf. He is one of the co-inventors of IPv4 and IPv6. You could potentially, and with every right, call him one of the founders of the Internet. And he actually spoke recently at the Applied Physics Laboratory. He did not have a lot of time for questions. Turns out he has a hearing deficiency, or beginning to lose his hearing, which is a shame. But he did leave us all with one quote. And he told us, if you do just one thing after leaving here, ask your Internet service provider, what are their plans for IPv6 rollout? Tell them that you are interested. Tell them that matters to you and you want it to happen. Otherwise, they will ignore it, and they will wait until it's too late, and you'll be in real trouble. So that's Vince Cerf, and we understand he wants to use IPv6. So before we get started on some of the histories and some of the technologies behind IPv4 and IPv6, I want to go through a little analogy here. Has anybody ever seen the movie Uncle Buck? John Candy? Okay. I happen to have, or rather I should say, my wife has an Uncle Buck. It's not John Candy. It's this fellow up here on the right-hand side. His name's Clemson. He's a former GE, General Electric aerospace engineer. He worked for NASA during the Apollo missions. And he was on the aircraft carriers when they brought back both Apollo 8, for the first round trip around the moon, and Apollo 11 on the USS Hornet, I think it was the Hornet, when they brought back Apollo 11 from actually landing on the moon. He was on the aircraft carrier, and he helped develop the system to track the capsule upon re-entry into Earth. He's also a big Facebook fan, and he's just trying to get into the internet and some of the more things like Reddit, Facebook. He didn't get into the internet in time for some of the other social media sites, but he's a big fan of the internet now because he's retired. He's got a lot of free time. So I talked to him recently and made mention to him that I'm going to be giving a presentation at Penn State. It's on IPv6. He barely knows what an IP address is. He likes the internet, but he doesn't really understand some of the backbone technologies of it. He said, what the heck is IPv6? Can you explain this to me? I'm an aerospace engineer, and I still don't know what you're talking about. So I had to think about it for a moment, and I used a pretty good analogy, and others have used this across the internet. I'm not old enough to remember this, but I'm told that the phones used to be set up on a very simple system in which you picked up the receiver and you were connected to an operator. And you said, hey, Mabel, can you go ahead and get me the Robertsons down the street? They're at, say, Towson 32181. If you watch some of the old black and white movies, that's what you'll actually see. They pick up and they basically say this neighborhood and this phone. Or this number, because that's how the telephone systems work. They had a very small switch, a very small area, only a limited number of houses, and not everybody had a phone. You were pretty well off if you had a phone. Later on, as the technology progressed with phone switching technology, phones became cheaper and cheaper, and just about everybody could afford to have a phone line in the house. At that point, with population explosion of the baby boomers, that sort of thing, they started to realize, gosh, we're running out of numbers. Our current system is not going to hack. So they started going over to the prefix system. I am old enough to remember this. They just had to dial the prefix, such as 371 and 2181, and that's how you reach your local phones. And that was your local calling, and that worked absolutely fine. On about the late 80s, they started to realize, wow, fax machines, and now people are getting these phones in their cars. We're still running out of numbers. We have to actually use area codes. Before, area codes were just in use for if you had to do long distance and you had to call out of state. For instance, Maryland used to be entirely a 3-to-1 area code, and that was it, the entire state. Now I think we have 6, and we're actually getting more because of the explosion of cellular phones, faxes, alternative numbers for people's homes. So I explained to Uncle Buck, this is a very good analogy of what's happening with the internet right now. We had a lot of numbers that people were using it. If you had a computer in the house, you were doing pretty well. Then you and your wife got a computer and or a laptop. Then all of a sudden, kids got iPod touches. Now you have cell phones which connect up to Wi-Fi and everything like that. All of them need numbers, and they're all public. Many of them were public numbers. In short, the internet is running out of numbers. I should say it has run out of numbers for public numbers. So that's a fairly good analogy. So a little history of IP version 4. IP version 4, again, was co-invented by Vint Cerf. It was developed in the 1970s. The military and a number of other universities were using a network, using what's called a network control protocol to connect fewer than 1,000 hosts on the internet. And they realized that the network control protocol was starting to get a little long in the tooth, and it was having some difficulties keeping up with the amount of traffic used on the internet. So they decided to develop this thing called Transmission Control Protocol Internet Protocol, TCP/IP. I gave this presentation last year, and I actually made a mistake on the slide, because most of the text that you will research on the internet actually say, well, they thought this was all fine, 4.3 billion numbers, which is going to be the total number of addresses available on IPv4. They thought this was fine. When I spoke with Vint Cerf, where I asked him a few questions when he came to the laboratory, he actually corrected me. And he said, no, IP version 4 was actually an experiment we were asked to develop as a potential successor to network control protocol. He said it was never intended to actually go full force. It was never intended to actually be used in the wild or in use full time. It wasn't quite ready. IP version 4 wasn't ready for prime time, in his opinion. Someone got a hold of IPv4 and started integrating it into the systems. And before he knew it, it was too late. He couldn't draw it back, and they decided to use it for the military and hooking up these computers because it worked. And there were a number of managers who said, this will be absolutely fine, it'll be plenty. Don't worry about it. And he told us that IPv6 is actually the protocol they had in mind when they were designing TCP/IP, because they wanted something that would be inexhaustible. And while IP version 4 has handled things pretty well, it's now over. So, through the history, again, in 1983, January 1st, 1983, the entire internet was moved from network control protocol, they had fewer than 1,000 hosts. Old Ronnie decided to lay down the law and say, we're going to move over this internet thing over to this new protocol. On a single day, they switched the entire internet. That would be inconceivable today. In one day. So things were working pretty well. Most folks were still using dial-up. If you were on the Mac platform, chances are you were using AppleTalk as your protocol of choice, and just about everybody used that. There's almost zero configuration. And you just plug things in, your printers work, the machines could talk together. You were probably using something like NetWare using IPX, SPX. Did anybody ever use that at some point? Right. Does anybody use IPX, SPX any longer? Not really. Does anybody use AppleTalk any longer? Not really. And there were a number of other protocols that have come and gone since then because people realized everything's going over to TCP/IP. By 1991, oops. Something up here. Thank you, Adobe. Anybody else dealing with Adobe issues right now? Okay, 1991, World Wide Web is developed at CERN. This is actually the very first web server. This is on Nextbox. This is the European Center for Nuclear Research, CERN. And after the World Wide Web was developed, the internet pretty much took off. It now provided a GUI interface instead of a text-based interface for the layman. Everybody and their aunts and uncles and their sons and uncles and nephews could get onto the internet because they had the World Wide Web. In 1992, the number of hosts had exploded over to 1 million, a lot more than 1,000, just about 90 previously. 1994, there was a milestone on the internet where up until 1994, if you wanted to register a host, it was absolutely 100% free. You could say, this is the address I'm using for my host. Please write this down in a DNS entry, and it was absolutely free. And there was actually a couple of guys who would register that for you. At that time, it became way too cumbersome, way too difficult, way too time-consuming. So no more free registration, and that's where things like GoDaddy and that sort of thing cropped up. So the history of IPv4, again, just a little sort of go over again. 1994, the prediction of IPv4 being exhausted is dated somewhere between 2005 and 2011. The folks who were running the internet numbers and for registration of numbers realized there has to be a successor. What are we going to do? Because eventually these numbers are going to run out. In the 1990s, we had the huge .com bubble. Everybody could get online. Everybody could set up a host. Amazon was born. A number of other places were born. Google, Yahoo, that sort of thing, online commerce. In the 2000s, explosion of personal phones and connections needed. Web, email, social media. I think Facebook is now boasting, 400 million or 600 million users? Something of that nature, 600 million users just on their site alone. In 2011, February 1st, the very last block, the very last free block of IPv4 numbers was doled out. There are no more numbers. There has not been for over 2 years now. There will be no more ever again. So they were actually kind of optimistic on the timeline on how long IP version 4 addresses would last. So it's over now, and the only reason we're not in a panic and crisis right now is because of NAT, Network Address Translation, where a lot of your systems can use a locally available number or a small number instead of a publicly available IP address. So a little history in IPv6. 1994, they realized it has to be a successor for the old-style IP version 4, and it's recognized they have to work on that. 1995, the very first publication or submission were, how about this? How about we do something like this? The IPv6 proposal was first documented and worked against standardize on the protocol and make it a standard across the world so the machines can still talk together. I can't overstate this enough. It's very important to make sure the protocol is working properly. A colleague of mine by the name of Ed Hart, and I don't know if you can actually look him up on Google or Wikipedia. Ed Hart recently retired, and I had the pleasure of working with him. Has anybody heard of Unicode here? Okay. Ed Hart was one of the co-developers of Unicode. And Unicode was actually developed back in the 70s because there were two different competing systems on how to do text on computers. And the two different systems didn't like each other at all. Ed Hart was one of those people who decided to get the people together to make Unicode so the computers could start talking with each other and standardize on a text-based protocol. And on 1998, they decided to actually standardize on the IPv6 protocol on this net through the Internet Engineering Task Force. So that's terrific. They standardized on the protocol, and they gave it up to the world and said, here's what you can do for the next generation of TCP/IP. And most vendors went, yawn. They said, fine, IPv4 version 4 is working fine for us. For us to actually implement, design for this, train people for this, or to find qualified people, it's going to cost us money. And right now, if there's not a business driver, we're not going to implement it. So support of this actually languished for quite a bit. In 2003, they actually decided to make a mandate through the U.S. government. They said all of the offices, like Department of Justice, Department of Energy, Department of the Interior, that sort of thing, we want to mandate that you must have an IP version 6 backbone. They actually pushed this back by a few months, about 6 or 8 months, and they did eventually get the IPv6 backbone sort of working. They used some tunneling protocols. It says here it's the number. So technically they're adhering to the mandate from the government, but it's kind of a kludge. So in the mid-2000s, we're still running out of numbers, and it's infinite. So again, how IP version 4 works. A system comes online, and it's a DHCP request. Anybody who has like a router at home or their small business has used this before. A DHCP DNS server responds and hands up a leased address. It's actually a decimal octet, and it has a capability of 4.3 billion numbers. That's 2 to the 32nd power. Which an example would be 128.183.144, etc. The 4.3 billion theoretical addresses are strictly theoretical. That doesn't mean those addresses are actually used. Quite a number of that 4.3 billion is worthless. It's something that doesn't route very well on VLAN, so it's not used very well. IP version 4 also relies heavily on network address translation and network classes. Here at the laboratory, we're actually using a Class B address. If you're using something like the Senate or the White House, they're actually usually on Class B address as well. There's a Class A, which is an enormous amount of leased numbers, and Class C, which is what we're using, are things like 10.10 numbers, 10.100, or 192.168. You're probably all familiar with those. So the NAT is actually moving from your Class C network, with those smaller numbers, a very small VLAN range, about 250 numbers, up into a public IP number. And it's doing that because there's a packet where there's a MAC address actually stamped in every single packet that goes across that wire. And it denotes, it says the MAC address for the Ethernet adapter on this machine is going out to this public number. And it's basically funneling it out to the larger internet. When the larger internet replies back, it responds back with another packet which has that same MAC address. And it comes through the NAT, and when the router hits it, it takes a look at the MAC address stamped on that packet and reroutes it to that smaller number where your machine is existing. So that's how IP version 4 works. Again, relying heavily on that. For IP version 6, we went with a different route. Because there are so many numbers, you don't have to use NAT. You don't have to use the network address translation. In the IP version 6, if you had a RADVID, or a router advertising database, this server works very much like a DHCP server, except it's only handing out VLAN information. Once a client gets hold of the RADVID information, it says, okay, I'm now going to be on this VLAN, but in order to complete the IPv6 address, it's actually going to use its own MAC address to generate a hexadecimal IP number. The hexadecimal being not just numbers 1 through 9, but actually A, B, C, D, E, and F. And because the number is completely unique, a clear path is made, so there's no more NAT. For the chips in your routers, those are actually pretty powerful chips. And every time that router grabs it, or that chip in that router grabs a packet, it has to take a look at the MAC address, stamp on the packet, and reroute it over. That's a lot of work for a processor. If the numbers are completely unique, that means you can essentially move the packet very quickly and without a whole lot of taking a look at the packets and route it very quickly. So it's actually much, much faster. And a clear path is made between the hosts. IP version 6 is actually classes, or class list. There are no class A, class B, class C networks. And it actually makes 2 to the 128 power of addresses. When I attended a seminar a few years ago, someone actually pulled out the number and said that's 3.4 undecillion. I had never heard of undecillion up until that time. And he explained that it's 3.4 times 10 to the 36th power. If you take a look at it, this is IP version 4 up here, which is what I've denoted. Okay, that's the total potential numbers. The human body has 10 to the 14th power. So you've got that. Now, for IP version 6, yes, the question.
What are you counting for the human body then?
I'm going to show that in just a moment here. For the human body, where it says the human body has just 10 to the 14th power, that's the number of cells in your body. Okay? The number of cells, your fingernail, your hair, your heart, your lungs, everything, they're all made up of individual cells. You have approximately 10 to the 14th power number of cells. For IP version 6, they have 3.4 times 10 to the 36th. And what that means is, if we gave an IP address to every single cell in your body, we could do that for Rich, for Eric, Tom, Dick, Harry, Susie, Jane, and Tom, and everybody else. Every man, woman, and child on the planet could get an IP address for every single cell in their body, and we still have over half the numbers of IPv6 left.
It won't matter if we can't get it.
Well, that's true. That's true. It won't matter if we can't get on the other through AT&T Wi-Fi. If you've ever heard of XKCD, the comic, they actually put a comic out a little while back where basically they're on a space station and the nanobots have decided to convert the Earth over to those little gray stuff, which nanobots do. And this is actually a fairly accurate representation because the nanobots have converted about 40% of the Earth to little gray dust. And the nanobots are actually running over IPv6. But that's actually a fairly accurate representation. Another analogy would be that if you gave an IPv6 address to every grain of sand on every single beach on the planet, you're still going to have some numbers left over. It's a tremendous amount of numbers. So, why is this any better? Did I mention the number of numbers? It's a lot of addresses. I can't say it's infinite, but it's about as inexhaustible as it's ever going to get. IPv6 also runs over 128-bit packet size. IP version 4 runs over 32-bit. So you have quite a bit of speed. Imagine if you have a garden hose and you have to keep pulling the trigger in order to get the water out. But you're only allowed to get a stream that's 3.2 inches long. Or you can get a stream that's 12.8 inches long. Not quite on the numbers, but at any rate, the packet size is actually 4 times the length, 4 times the size. That is ideal if you're doing video, voice over IP, or anything that requires quite a bit of bandwidth. 128-bit packets are going to carry a lot of data much, much faster. IP security is actually built in, so the data, which is contained in all those packets, is actually already encrypted in IPv6. And it's translated through, and it's decrypted on the other side. IP version 6 is a standard, and has been since 1998. It is gaining more and more support through vendors, through application developers, through operating system developers, such as Apple, Microsoft, Linux, that sort of thing. And here's another little secret. IP version 4, since it was invented right here in America, I should say, we got the vast amount of IPv4 addresses. So we have the vast number. Asia and Europe, since they were, fine, we're going to be friends with London, we're going to be friends with Paris. Asia and Europe did not get a tremendous amount of IPv4 addresses. Africa got even less. You want to take a guess how much Australia got? Not very much either. So IPv6 is actually really in use and it's on fire in places like Japan, in Africa, because it makes sense to them because they don't have many IP version 4 addresses. So for them, it's only natural to go over to IPv6. It's the new protocol, and for them, they've already used up their addresses, their address space. Again, it's suitable for use and it's ideal for voice over IP and video. Netflix, just about a year ago, permanently turned on IPv6 capabilities on their servers. I think someone had mentioned or I read somewhere that a full 25 to 30% of traffic over the internet can actually be attributed to video, and most of that is Netflix. So Netflix did the world a favor. They permanently turned on IPv6 capability. So what does an IPv6 number look like? This is your 128-bit number, and you can tell this would be a real pain to type in. If anyone's typed in a server address, like I have to connect to this server, here's my IP address instead of the host name because I haven't quite got DNS working properly yet. If you type in like 192.168.104, that's fairly easy to type in. Does anyone want to type in the number at the top? If you be long pain, then it'd probably be very, very susceptible to user error and typing in something incorrectly. When they designed IPv6, they recognized this because of the length of the address and because now it's using hexadecimal code and not just numerical numbers. We're going to have to make this a little bit easier for everyone. So many of the addresses are going to have a large volume of zeros within the address. We used a notation so that you can truncate those numbers down. So if you have an IPv6 address, again up at the top, you see a number of zeros all in the middle of the string. You can use a technique called the reduction of zeros. So if there's a large number of zeros in order, you can reduce it down to just 1 0 and put that colon in. And that means for that whole octet, for that whole section, I'm just going to represent this as a single zero. If you have a long train of numbers, or zeros, any within your number, you can actually denote it as 2 double quotes. You can only use it one time though. So you're actually doing a collapsing of zeros in your IPv6 address. So it saves you a little bit of time if your numbers have a lot of zeros within that string. Here we have an example. This is running 10.7 on my Mac computer at home. And I have IPv6 running. You can see down the bottom, configure IPv6 automatically. You can see my router address and my IPv6 address on my router on my Macintosh at home. This is a Windows XP system which I leave around to kick and hit in the corner. But you can see this is actually making use of IPv6 as well. You also make mention, you should make mention right here, if you take special note and look at the Windows XP window here, you'll see that there's also a Pareto tunneling pseudo interface. Since about Windows XP, Microsoft has made the Pareto tunneling available on default on most of your Windows systems. This can be a good thing, except that there's very little firewall capability built into their Pareto tunnel, which can create a problem, and that's why most folks who have to administer Windows machines in the environment actually disable IPv6 instead of leaving it 1 by default. So, who's running IPv6 right now? Mac OS 10, since Jaguar 10.2, has been able to work over IPv6, and the Airport Extreme routers, which are made by Apple, have IPv6 capability, and they have a built-in functionality to do an IPv6 to IPv4 tunnel. And we'll get into that just a little bit later. Since version 4 of the iOS, you can now run that on your iPod Touch, your iPhone, and your iPad, but only since version 4 and beyond. The Android OS, since at least version, I think it was 2.1, and I forget what the name of it was. 2.2 was Froyo, frozen yogurt. I think version 2.1, they actually introduced IPv6 support right out of the box on any Android device, your tablet or your phone. For the Linux operating system, for quite some time, since at least about the early 2000s, this has had support on just about every single distribution out there. Ubuntu Linux, Red Hat, SUSE, you name it, it has support for IPv6 on the Linux systems. Microsoft actually, to their credit, began with a sort of test or a beta IPv6 functionality within Windows NT version 4. It was something you could download from Redmond, Washington. You could install on your NT4 server and try out IP version 6. They did a full implementation within Windows XP. Again, they did sort of like a pseudo beta with the Windows 2000 server. Unix and Solaris, if you have the USD, little daemon there, that supports IPv6 right out of the box as well. Hewlett-Packard printers, and just about everybody here who's ever worked on a printer has touched a Hewlett-Packard device. Hewlett-Packard is a big supporter of IPv6, and just about all of their modern printers produced within, say, the past 4 or 5 years will support IPv6. Mine at home plugged it into my home network, and since I have IPv6 running off of my router, my printer got a IPv6 address, which is beautifully fine, and works fine over IPv4 as well. So what doesn't support yet? Nintendo's Wii. Sadly, it does not have IPv6 support. I have Netflix running with my Wii, and I wanted to see, hey, Netflix turned on IPv6 support for over the network. And it turns out, well, no, the videos know better because we don't support anything beyond IPv4. Microsoft's Xbox, there is no IPv6 support. I think they just introduced Xbox One this couple days ago. I'm not really certain about that, so I'll probably have to update this slide in a few minutes. The Sony PlayStation, my son has a PS3. Turns out it has no IPv6 support either. A little disappointed by that. The Blackberries, nope, no IPv6 support. I don't hold a lot of hope for that either. It is offering IPv6. Chances are, if you live in the Mid-Atlantic region, you're using one of these ISPs for either your home or your business. I myself am a Comcast user, and they support and they actually encourage users to set up their own tunnels through 6 to 4, and they've been doing some testing for about the past 2 or 3 years. They are now, starting in late 2012, they're starting to offer what's called dual stack. Dual stack means they're giving a full public IPv4 address, as well as a number of IPv6 numbers. So you're running IPv4 as one protocol, and IPv6 as another protocol, and it's a full 128-bit connection through IPv6. They're offering that now to some of the business customers. If you check out their website and you're a small business, you can actually apply to be on their testing group. So if you're a Comcast customer for Comcast Business, that sort of thing, I highly encourage you to go ahead and take a look at their website, ask them, I'd like to try this out, I'd like to be a beta tester for this.
Any idea how many addresses are given?
Giving out?
Yeah.
I did try to speak with a Comcast representative about 2 or 3 months. After the first contact, it took them 3 weeks to get back to me. I was told I would get another reply back shortly. Never heard back from them. I'm sorry?
It's still short.
It's still short.
For them. That's a short amount of time for them.
It's still a short amount of time, yes. Sorry. Yeah, they never really quite got back to me. I'm waiting for what the phrase were. But I did speak with a representative, and from what I understand, that they would hand out essentially a IPv6 number. If you're a business customer, an IPv6 number for each of your hosts. For some of their residential customers, they said, yes, we will support IPv6. You get one address. To me, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's not like you're going to run out. So just give me a whole bunch of addresses, or give me a whole VLAN of IPv6 numbers I can use throughout my household. They have since backpedaled on that, and they decided to actually implement that for some of their newer technology. There's a question for that?
Yeah, you were saying before that your IPv6 addresses has your MAC address encoded in it, so how can they give you addresses beforehand since they don't know your MAC addresses of your devices?
Okay, I apologize I didn't give you the microphone. I'll repeat the question. The question was, how are they giving you an IPv6 address when the address is actually based off of the MAC address? Again, what your ISP would be doing is using a RAD bit. That router advertiser daemon simply tells your machine, this is the VLAN, this is the range that I want you to use. The client itself completes and finishes the address by tacking on its own MAC address under that IPv6 address. So if someone is offering you IPv6 connectivity, they're not telling you the full address. That is left up to the client machine to determine the full address that's going to be used. And the MAC address is essentially tacked onto the bottom, or onto the very end of it. Does that answer your question?
You only get the prefix.
Yes, that's correct. You're only going to get the prefix. The address is completed by the client because the client would know best as to what MAC address they wish to use, whether it's their Wi-Fi adapter, their wired adapter, FireWire, what have you.
So when they give you one address, it should be sufficient because you're still going to get all, you're not going to have duplicates within your equipment.
No, but you still need to be able to route all the additional addresses after the prefix.
That's right.
So you still control the routing of the ISP.
Right. So the internet service provider will essentially give you the prefix number. The clients finish up the addresses. When I say they're only giving you one number, it means they're only allowing you to do one number connect out to the rest of the world, out through the public IP address space. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Cox Communications, apparently this is down in the DC and Virginia area. They have some limited residential testing, and that started actually this year, just a few months ago. They're using a 6-to-4 tunneling technique for the commercial index or for the commercial companies. They are doing some dual stack for a lot of businesses. I can't get a lot of information on Cox Communications, so you have to try and contact them. AT&T, as of about a year ago, they were still in preparation status or in upgrade mode. They have now stepped up to move over to a tunneling technique called 6RD. 6RD actually stands for IPv6 Rapid Deployment. It's a managed tunneling capability, and what it does is it takes your IPv6 traffic and encapsulates it within IPv4 traffic. So AT&T is making some inroads through that. Again, I've updated this slide since just about a year ago. Time Warner Cable, their IP version 6 is fully functional on their backbone. They do offer some dual stack support for some of their commercial or their business customers. For the home customers, they're still pointing them to figure it out on yourself, make it IP version 6 tunnel. And they're leaving that up to the customers because in their minds, essentially, the customers don't really need it just yet. If you have Quest Communications, an extremely fast internet service provider, they are offering dual stack connections. Quest is unlikely to offer you anything if you're a small business or a residential customer. They are huge facility driven, such as the laboratory themselves or some other enterprise, some very large location. So, how can you get on IPv6? Largely, you have to rely upon your internet service provider in order to get connectivity up to the IP version 6 network-based internet. So if you don't have that, you're not necessarily stuck. The best way to go is absolutely dual stack, where you're getting a full IP version 4 capability to the internet, but you're also getting a full 128-bit connectivity to the IP version 6 protocol host on the same internet. If you don't have any capability with IP version 6 through your internet service provider, you can use what's called tunneling. And again, that's an encapsulation of IP version 6 traffic over existing IP version 4 packets. There's a number of different tunneling techniques. Some of them are called Pareto. Pareto, I think, is the name that's been used for some of the Linux distributions. 6-to-4, 6-and-4, 6-over-4, 6 rapid deployment. Whatever they want to call it, it's essentially wrapping IP version 6 into an IP version 4 packet. They're cheats, but they are clever, and it will get you connected to some of the IP version 6 hosts on the internet. So, I'm going to walk you through a few things here, how you can make your own tunnel. Does anybody recognize the picture down the bottom? Shawshank Redemption. This is when Andy actually made his, when Andy actually made his way out of the cell and through his own terminal. So this is how you can get out of the IP version 4 internet and actually tunnel out to IP version 6. The big tools you're going to need are a replacement firmware for most likely your home router, and the firmware is DDWRT. It is actually a project which is largely based upon OpenWRT. It is Linux-based, and it will replace the firmware on most commercial brand routers, essentially your Linksys, your Netgear, ASUS routers, that sort of thing. If you have a small router which you purchased at, say, Staples or Best Buy, somewhere anywhere between like $25 and $150, chances are DDWRT is going to have a firmware version for your router. So you can get your router capable of IP version 6 absolutely free through the replacement firmware, but you're still going to use what's called a tunnel broker, and that's Hurricane Electric. I'll go through that in just a little bit. Hurricane Electric offers free tunneling accounts, so you don't have to pay for anything to make up a tunnel through Hurricane Electric. Now, before you make any changes to your home setup, what you want to do is record all of the settings on your home router. That includes your host name, the addresses that you're using for your boxes, any port traffic or port forwarding that you have on your home network. Write it all down. My suggestion is do a whole lot of screen snapshots So you capture the data before you do anything at all. Once you're certain you've got all the settings recorded for your home router setup, go ahead and go to the DDWRT and grab the firmware, which is intended for your machine. Make sure you record all the settings. Once you start on this, there is no going back. So, the first thing I would suggest, take a hard look at your routing technologies. Take a look at the maker, the model that they have, and also models have different versions. One router in particular, I think it's Lancaster came out with the WRT54G series. I think they're now at 9 versions of the same router. They have gone through numerous incarnations of different RAM, different flash capabilities. They've moved from Broadcom processors to Atheros processors. All these different versions require different firmware and require different distributions of the firmware from DDWRT. So make sure you pay special attention to the version of the router that you have. So take a look at the router, make sure you've got the proper information, download the proper firmware replacement off of DDWRT, and follow any instructions we may have there. So this is the DDWRT website. You click on your router database, type in your manufacturer. Chances are they will have a package, a firmware package for your make and model. Okay, just make sure you get the right one. Chances are there's going to be some additional information or like little readmes on tips and tricks how to make sure the firmware upgrade goes properly. If you don't follow these instructions, if they're there, there's a fairly good chance you could break the router and have a very expensive paperweight now sitting on your desk. Please, we don't need any more e-waste in America. Make sure you get the right thing. Don't make any bricks. I'd hate to have somebody follow these instructions and say, darn it, you bricked my router. So, go ahead and flash your router. This is a demo page from a very, sort of midline Cisco router. You're going to go ahead and apply the firmware update through its own page. So flash your router and be patient. It will take probably 5 to 10 minutes for this to finish. It has to completely overwrite the ROM on the machine. So once you're done flashing it, you want to do what's called a 30-30-30 reset. This means while the router is plugged in, go ahead and push in where you press that reset button, hold it in for at least 30 seconds. At that time, while you're still depressing that little reset button, pull the plug on the router. Count to at least 30. Plug the power back into the router. Doing that, make sure and ensures that all of the NVRAM of the router is completely wiped clean, so you don't have any information from the previous firmware now sitting on your box and potentially making problems in your router. If you decide you don't want to use DDWRT and you want to just try to set up an IPv6 tunnel because you say you have an airport extreme router, I highly recommend you can do this reset for 30-30-30, blow away any of the NVRAM settings. This works very, very well on making sure your router works properly. So once you flashed it, now you can take a visit to Hurricane Electric. They are an absolutely free broker, and I think they're based out of Fremont, California, very close to San Francisco. And you can sign up for an IPv6 tunneling account through them. Once you set up an account, you want to set up a tunnel capability through them, they will give you some information here. You want to set up for a free IPv6 tunnel broker on their site. Once you have created the tunnel, your Hurricane Electric's website should be smart enough that it realizes the public IP that you're currently using at the home. So it's going to use that to say, well, say you're in Baltimore. For me, the closest tunnel endpoint would be Washington, D.C. If you're in Philadelphia, congratulations, there's one in Philadelphia. If you're in New York, there's one in New York, there's one in Chicago. There's a number of different sites where it's the other end of Hurricane Electric's for their tunneling capability. So write down all of this information. You will need it later for the next step. Again, note your tunnel settings and make sure you do a screenshot for yourself. Make sure you write it down, but also do a screenshot to make sure you've got everything to refer to later on. Now, DDWRT does have some IPv6 capability, but it needs some help. Within DDWRT, there is a page called Startup Scripts, or a Startup section. That means every time the router resets or every time the router starts up, it's going to run a script. It looks very similar to something like Bash on your Macintosh. someone who's much, much smarter than me came out with a script which would work with your hurricane electric tunnel and set up all the pieces and parts for DDWRT to make use of a hurricane electric tunnel. Down here, you'll see actual new link, and we'll be making the slides available so you can copy off that link if you wish. Grab a copy of the script. Once you've got the script and you've inserted it into the start page for your DDWRT, there's about 4 to 6 lines that you have to enter in your own information. Once you've got your information in, unplug the router, plug the 10, plug it back in. Your router should now be handing out IPv6 information to your systems, and they'll complete it with their own MAC address. So that then you can get onto the IPv6. You now complete your IPv6 tunnel, and you go into IPv6 sites. Okay, so let's say you got it working. Great, now what do? Well, there's quite a few IPv6 only sites. Facebook, since they want to make sure that they can connect to all their Asian and European customers, has a site which you can test Facebook connectivity, www.v6.facebook.com. Google has IPv6.google.com. Not that I've ever used it, but I have heard that BitTorrent makes heavy use of IPv6 in European and Asian clients, I've heard, and it comes down very, very quickly. If your website is enabled for IPv6, just about any modern browser, that includes Chrome, Firefox, Safari, if they see a website that supports both IPv4 and IPv6, it will by default use the IPv6 connectivity to that website. So they tend to load a little bit faster. Now, I will tell you the latency is much, much better. It's much improved over IPv6. But do remember that you're encapsulating IPv6 over IPv4 packets. So the throughput and the speed is not going to be there so long as you're on a tunnel. But you will get connectivity. Remember, you're using a cheat. You're using a tunnel. It's not dual stack. So dual stack is definitely a way to go, but the tunnel will still get you there. So if you have a business, there are a number of folks who are pushing out information or pushing out devices that you can use at your enterprise level. GoGoNet has a GoGo 6 server. You can see it's actually about a 1U in size. And this will essentially do some tunneling protocols for your entire enterprise, handing out those prefixes for IPv6. Your clients figure out the last part of that IPv6 address and use the tunneling to connect your machines up to the IPv6 internet. So you can use GoGoNet's clients for some IPv6 tunneling. Cisco has actually come out with a network crossing bridging capability. Again, it's about 1U in size. And this is if you have an ISP which has full-on IPv6 compatibility or connectivity to your enterprise. You can use this to manage it and also set up some firewalls for IPv6. I'll be honest with you, I have not been able to institute this in my own enterprise because I'm not part of the networking team. And we have some very, very high security requirements. So if I actually would try to implement this, I would get in trouble. So I can do this at home, however. Unfortunately, I can't afford Cisco routers at home. I just don't have the money for it. So if you have a business, by all means, and if you get a blessing from your management, you can take a look at these two devices at the very least as a potential for including IPv6 on your enterprise network. So as time goes by, adoption of IPv6 is gathering steam and speed. Start making your plans right now. Even if you've just got a tunnel working on your home network, you can take a look at the addresses. You can try getting some DNS working. You can try typing in the addresses in the truncated form with the reduction of zeros and collapse of zeros. The more you become familiar with it, the more comfortable you'll be with it, and when you eventually include it into your enterprise network, it will help you make sense of it. If anybody was around when you shifted from AppleTalk to IPv4, it was a bit of a pain. Sometimes your printers didn't use IPv4 whatsoever, and you had to set up a little piece of software on an old Mac to use the local talk port. It was a bit of a pain, but after a few years, it came through and everything started working fine. Then you had things like AppleShare IP. If anybody remembers that? AppleShare IP was specifically based off of AppleShare, which worked entirely over AppleTalk, and then they started doing AppleTalk over TCP/IP. So that's how things are going to progress. You're going to eventually run full stack. Eventually, everything will start supporting IP version 6, and IP version 4 will fall by the wayside, very much the same way that AppleTalk sort of fell by the wayside once we started using IP version 4. So, by all means, read, learn, experiment, contact your ISP. Let them know you're interested in this. Tell them that you want this, and tell them why. If they don't hear from you, they won't care, because it's a business-driven model. If there's no demand or very little demand, they won't implement it. They have no motivation to do so. DualStack's going to be around for quite some time. Eventually, everything's going to go over to IP version 6. So that's about it. Does anybody have any quick questions? I have a microphone here if questions. Bear with me, Rich. I'm going to turn on the microphone here. They said the recording is very important. There you go.
This is a follow-up on your point about DDWRT and flashing your router. I personally was not brave enough to flash my own router. So what I did, I went out to eBay. There are people that will sell you a router with DDWRT pre-installed. And switched over to that, and I'm much happier.
Good. Good for you. And it's worked out very well for you?
Yeah, it's worked out. I didn't set it up for IPv6, but I managed to get a lot more capability out of my route. I got one of the Asus N16 routers, and it's a beautiful box.
Buffalo routers will sell you a router with DWRT.
Oh, that's cool.
If for the recording, Buffalo Technologies, if you've never heard of them, make some really great little pieces of hardware. And it turns out that they decided to nix any of their own firmware plans and just go ahead and pre-install DDWRT on their own routers. There's a cliche that essentially you can take a $30 router, flash it with DDWRT, and turn it into a $300 router. It is a lot of capabilities, and it's absolutely free. It's nothing short of a miracle, in my opinion. Thank you, Rich. There's another question.
You've primarily addressed the client side. Could you flip it over and talk a little bit about the implications for DNS if you're running dual stack on a server?
Okay, the question was about DNS and everything. You have to make sure, for your home side, I do not have a DNS server at my house. I'll be honest with you. I have IP version 6 running, and is connecting into the IP version 6 network, internet, but that does not mean my systems will respond to DNS. You have to have a server which is capable of registering that information for that IPv6 address over DNS for version 6. I don't yet have that capability. I desperately want it, but I don't yet have it. If you're working on the enterprise, it would behoove you to talk with your network folks and network admins. Chances are they're running something like, we were using something called VitalQIP, which was developed by Lucid Technologies, that sort of thing. They're now defunct. We switched over to something called Infoblox. I don't know if anybody else here makes use of it. It does have some limited V6 capability. It also has DNS capability over V6. It's just not been completely implemented yet. Again, talk to your vendors, see if they have a plan to implement things like DNS capability over IP version 6. There's another question. And back to you.
On the DNS type of question, because I have to ask, when you're setting up a network for, let's say, a small business, because obviously an enterprise is a completely different can of worms than a small business. If every single person has their own public IP address, which is basically what's happening, how are we dealing with firewalls then? How are you protecting all your inside now we have a NAT router, and while NAT comes with its own set of problems, it's a beautiful thing for hiding.
Yes, and that is one of the potential bad things, or the potential gotchas of implementing IPv6 on your network, is that a lot of vendors, operating system or router technologies, remember, it's a clear channel, and it's a clear path from host to host, and that traffic is uninterrupted. There is no NAT, there is no built-in firewall. So if you're going to implement this on your enterprise, make sure that you understand that you have to have security built in to take a look at all those IP version 6 packets and be able to block potentially malicious things coming across your wire. There are some utilities will do that, and they're very, very few. But it's one of the things you have to be cautious of. That's why I recommend try it out at your home first. Flash your home router, get it used, because chances are you don't have critical things within your home system. Yes, your family pictures, yes, your music, yes, a few documents. But it's not something which is your business. It's not something which is, for us, it's Department of Defense, and we absolutely can implement it, so we make sure we've got the tools to take a look at all the potential malicious things coming across the wire. So that is one of the bad things about IP version 6, is that vendor support for protecting your networks and protecting your client machines is sorely lacking just yet. It's getting better. It's just not completely there just yet.
So is that something we're going to do in a small office or in an SMB situation? Is that something that's still going to be
It's something
protected at the router, or are we going to have to touch every one of our clients and now rebuild all of our client images and deployment and turn on firewalls on every computer?
My advice would be both. Make sure you're blocking malicious things at the router and connecting up to the internet at large. But if you have a software-based firewall based upon your operating system, turn that on as well. It's going to be a bit of a pain, but it's a whole security issue when it comes up. Again, if anyone was around when Apple and everybody else made the transition from AppleTalk to TCP/IP, there was not the protection there. You could get a lot of malicious traffic over IP version 4 as opposed to AppleTalk, which was pretty much just those things within your building, or perhaps one building to the other over a small chain network. The capabilities and support of the vendors for protecting your systems, again, are sort of lacking. If you can get a vendor which has a router capability with V6, make sure it has that capability to block malicious traffic or to analyze each of the packets and protect your systems. If your operating system has the capability of software firewalls and protecting over IP version 6, turn it on. It's, as a good rule of thumb, it's better safe than sorry. Any other questions? Okay.
I was wondering, you mentioned that the packets are encrypted by default?
Yes, the data portion of the packet is encrypted.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about the benefits and possible drawbacks of that. Like, I'm assuming that you'll still have SSL certificates and things like that for encrypting on a broader level, but what does that encryption actually accomplish?
Well, if you've ever seen things like, I go to a website over HTTP instead of HTTPS, okay? That S means it's going over secure. That data within those packets is being encrypted from one side to the other. With an IP version 6, that's essentially built in. So HTTPS becomes largely redundant because the data within those packets is now encrypted. It's not in the open. It's not open text going across the wire. Such as, I'll give you a great example. At the laboratory, I set up a host to share out some files, and it had LDAP communications. And the LDAP communications has to be encrypted. It has to use HTTPS over this web page, because when a person types in their username and password, that text is in the open in the packet. It's very much readable. That was over IP version 4. Within IPv6, it's not imminently readable. So if someone's collecting those packets and doing a little snooping over your wire, it's still going to look at gibberish, as opposed to it's in the open, it's readily available, and can be read completely.
So does that mean that you foresee SSL not being necessary, or would it be more for identity verification purposes?
It will still be necessary, but it's IP version 6 helps it along. It's still going to be necessary for identification purposes. I think there was a question up front.
Two questions. One,
I'm sorry, just for the recording, they said please use the microphone. So,
related to that, well, let me just get that part. Do you have any advice or see caveats in the transition of like class 4 based VLANs on a private network, transitioning that, aside from like firewall issues, to IPv6? Like, if I've got a VLAN for phones that's based on IPv4, how does that play out, or how do you transition that to IP6 on your local network?
well, again, that's going to depend largely upon the vendor support. I don't know if you're using something like the Cisco phones or something of that nature. those, I don't know if Cisco phone technologies, I don't know if they support IP version 6. That's something we did not in the research yet. But ultimately it comes down to vendor support and whether or not you actually need it. Just because IP version 6 is out there and it has a lot of capabilities doesn't mean that you absolutely positively have to run it. If your phone network is running fine over IP version 4 and it's really just doing phone technology or it's doing VoIP over your local communication within your building or just a small set of buildings, you don't necessarily have to run IP version 6 for those phones. If vendor implementation is there, all the better, but it's not something which is crucial and necessary. Again, if you've got something that which is capable of doing dual stack, it'll do both protocols, that's the ideal world. It'll run both protocols, it'll communicate everything, or communicate to other devices which it has to communicate with and trade information. But if it's not capable of it, there's not going to be a lot of tremendous benefit over phones between building to building or office to office, that sort of thing. If you're in VoIP like intercontinental, like I was going to call Japan or something of that nature, yeah, IP version 6 would definitely help out because it's got the 128-bit packet size. And it's a much, much tighter and much more efficient scan. There's another question you have.
Get ready to joust.
So, do you foresee, for instance, the possibility that a router would proxy IPv6 addressing to a IPv4 network? If itself, if the router knew all the MAC addresses of the devices on the network and itself said, hey, to the internet, yeah, I'm using these addresses, let's route them for IPv6, but internally was really only using IPv4. The reason I ask that is for the purpose of security or for the purpose of NATing and just maintaining that firewall security type of thing.
I'll be honest with you, that's a technology I've not heard of. I know there is some capability to do NAT version 6, again, as a potential means of including a sort of firewall. And there is, you can do NAT over IP version 6, but again, you're running into an issue of you're putting an overhead upon the processor within that router. But the router now has to take a look at every single packet and pass it off to the client, from the client that actually needs it. So IP version 6 was designed to be a clear path, but you can run NAT version 6. It's just not encouraged, and again, they say, take a look at the packet itself as far as malicious traffic. And if it's something which looks like it's malformed, get rid of the packet, cut it off. So as far as actually doing a transition or moving it over, you're talking about something like a bridge network, if I understand it properly. I've not done a lot of research in that. I understand there are some products coming onto the market, or perhaps like some free Linux distributions you can set up on a little machine to sort of try it out to sort of act as a host. But it really comes down to that machine is functioning then as a tunnel for your IP version 4 clients, and it's basically acting as a funnel to go out to the rest of your IP version 6 connected network. Okay. So you're essentially talking about a tunnel where your machines don't get any IP version 6 traffic, and you're setting the bridge through that one host which is connected to the IP version 6 network. So it basically is a bridge. Again, if anybody did the transition from AppleTalk over to TCP/IP, you had a number of bridges. There was actually a cool piece of software Apple made freely available. You had like an old 2CI sitting around, and you had a local talk on the printer. You could set up that printer on that old like Mac 2CI and say that now the Mac 2CI is set up on TCP/IP, and it is proclaiming that I have a laser writer available for printing. It's essentially functioning as a bridge, which is what you're talking about. Before I get any other questions, I want to do one last thing, and that's the last slide here. Okay, one last thing. So Steve Jobs is gone now. I'm going to try to bring up one last thing. I do have a mystery box right here. So I'm going to ask a little question. I'll accept two different answers. Can anybody tell me what the number is for the theoretical amount of IP version 6 addresses? And no air can raise your hand. Does anybody remember? Right here.
For undecillion?
Undecillion, that is correct. You want to come up here and take your prize?
I'll go afterwards, so we don't.
Okay, he'll go afterwards. All right. Just to let you know, it is a DDWRT flash router that is fully capable of doing IP version 6. Highly recommend you go home, take a look at Hurricane Electric, set up IP version 6 on your home network. It'll do nice little router. So congratulations. else had a question? Rich?
Actually, it's a kind of
Go, yes.
This may not be something you know, but since the address is much longer for DNS, do you know for IPv6 DNS if there's any sort of assistant or error checking to make sure that you've actually gotten it in there right?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. Again, DNS over IP version 6 is not something I've had a chance to experiment with because I've set it up on my home network. I've not been able to or allowed to tinker with and experiment with in a larger enterprise network, which would require DNS connectivity. So I do have a big project for crash plan backups at my work at the moment. I did get a pseudo blessing from my supervisor and manager that said, yes, the laboratory is now out of IP version 4 numbers, and we had 2 really huge buildings come up online in the past couple of years. Those buildings did not get a publicly available IPv4 version 4 address. They got a NAT address. So now we have 2 6-story buildings on campus which have to run over NAT. And related to your DNS question, if you've ever had a mixed network of publicly available numbers, 128.183, and try to make DNS work properly with also a collection of NAT numbers, it's a nightmare for the networking group. So again, if the vendor technology is there to go ahead and support and say register with IP version 6 with the hosts on the internet, if the technology is there, you can implement it. It's just not something I've had a chance to experiment with. Yes.
Okay.
And there's another question in the back.
Since there is no NAT going on with IPv6, then therefore every DNS entry would be unique,
Yes.
contrary to the topology today. So is there a mechanism in plan for this topology where your DNS entry gets moved up? So that, at home we have DNS, we might have a DNS server for our home network. That doesn't go outside. So somebody can't do a DNS query and get your printer. But since every address is going to be unique, will you have that cascading where your DNS will push it up and someone could resolve your data if you don't have the security to block that?
Yes, but again, it's going to depend largely upon your internet service provider. If you have a fairly modern router, again, DDWRT will do this, it will make use of the host names they set up on your Mac or your Android phone or your Windows machine, and you can resolve it with your own little network. That DNS server built into that router will route the packets for that host name to the locally available address. In IP version 6, that router, the daemon, has to then pass that information up to the rest of the internet and say, listen, I have this host name. For APL, we have jhupapl.edu. So that is our business, and our end of that address is .edu. So we're technically an educational institution. We are the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. The machine name would be the host name of my computer, .jhupapl.edu. With IP version 6, it's still going to be the exact same thing. It's just a host name. Again, if you've ever made a server connection over the network and you just typed in the IP address instead of the host name, okay, that's quick and easy. You don't want to have to do that over IP version 6. As much as you can use the reduction of zeros or the collapsing of zeros, the far better thing is if you use the DNS host name of the machine, it will route you to the proper IP version 6 address and say, here, make the connectivity here through the host name. And that host name doesn't necessarily have to change. It's still going to be name of the machine, name of the enterprise, and either .u, .com, .org, what have you. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Superman over here?
I haven't taken a lot of notes, so maybe I missed. I don't know if someone said this already or asked this, so maybe I missed it. But I don't know if anybody's heard about Google Fiber.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm kind of excited. I was just curious. I haven't heard anything about it with IPv6, and I didn't know if it was capable of that if it ever comes to the area.
I know Google is one of the big proponents of IP version 6,
Yeah.
and I believe I read somewhere that Google Fiber will be connected into the IP version 6 network. Google themselves actually has 2 publicly available DNS servers Memory serves, it's 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4, if memory serves. And I believe those DNS servers will also connect you into the IP version 6 domains, or the IP version 6 hostings.
Open DNS will do.
Open DNS will too. There you go. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I hope
Okay.
it comes to the air soon. I really don't think it's cool, but
Okay. I think Google Fiber's in
Kansas State.
Kansas City. Okay. And there was a lot of cities going out for that. They bring in some Google and that sort of thing. So. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, one more question. Sorry.
Just curious about the overhead of the IPsec stack and what that means for like changing out network interfaces. Do they require a lot of processing power?
For
IPsec over.
For IP security? Well, again, that's going to rely almost entirely upon the client to actually encrypt that datagram, and it's going to have instructions for decrypting it on the other side of the machine. On the other side, will be able to decrypt it. Much like public and private keys, when a connection is made between the two computers, again, through a very clear and very direct channel, those two hosts essentially establish a protocol, those two hosts establish an agreement that here's how I want you to encrypt the datagram with my publicly available key, but it can only be decrypted through my private key. So when you send the packet information out to me, you're using my public key. When it arrives, I'm going to decrypt it with my private key. So as far as the IP security goes, it's going to be largely handled by the host itself, by the machine.
More to the point, what have you experienced a performance hit due to that?
I can't say I have. I can't say I honestly have. It's something which is fairly minor, and with the processors that we have today, it's a fairly minor thing. For the client to actually say, I need to set up the communication between this other host, that's not much processing power. The problem runs into when you have a router which is connecting hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of systems. For that one chip or that series of chips on that router to do all that overhead, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy. Chip heats up, chip might even slow down. If the chip just says, I'm just passing along the information, I don't have to really do a lot of interpretation on it. I'm just passing along that workload down into the network. Okay. We have just 3 minutes left. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.